Look at these models, Captain. This is the history of our progress. If you burn this, you burn the future itself. It is not military stores.
The War of 1812, often obscured in the grand sweep of history by the colossal struggles of the Napoleonic Wars occurring simultaneously across the Atlantic, reached its psychological and destructive zenith not on the Canadian frontier, but in the heart of the Chesapeake Bay. To understand the conflagration that would consume the American capital in August 1814, one must first traverse the preceding years of maritime strangulation and systematic terror that defined the British naval campaign in the region. This was not merely a military operation. It was a punitive expedition designed to break the spirit of a young republic that Great Britain viewed as an insolent upstart, stabbing the mother country in the back while she fought for the liberties of Europe against the tyranny of Bonaparte. By the beginning of 1813, the British Admiralty had recognized the Chesapeake Bay as the soft underbelly of the United States. While the American frigates Constitution and United States were winning single-ship duels that shocked the Royal Navy, the strategic reality was far grimmer for the Americans. The British established a blockade that effectively turned the Chesapeake into a British lake. The man chosen to enforce this stranglehold was Rear Admiral George Cockburn, an officer of singular aggression and tactical brilliance, whose name would become a curse word in American households from Norfolk to Baltimore. Cockburn differed temperamentally from his superior, Admiral Sir John Borlace Warren. Where Warren was often viewed as lethargic and cautious, Cockburn was a firebrand who believed in the efficacy of total war. He operated with a level of autonomy that allowed him to terrorize the coastline with impunity. His strategy was clear. By raiding the coastal towns and plantations, he would force the American government to divert its meager regular forces from the invasion of Canada to protect the capital region, thereby relieving the pressure on British North America. From February 1813 onwards, a British squadron began to patrol the bay, seizing merchant vessels and launching amphibious sorties against the inhabitants. The Royal Navy established a forward operating base on Tangier Island, a strategic location in the middle of the bay. This base served as more than just a naval depot. It became a symbol of the British threat to the American social order. Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, who would later succeed Warren, issued a proclamation from this region offering freedom to any enslaved person who would join the British cause. This was a masterstroke of psychological warfare in a slave-holding region. Thousands of enslaved men escaped to the British lines. They were not merely given refuge, they were trained and armed, formed into the corps of colonial Marines. These men, fighting for their own liberty against their former masters, proved to be among the most disciplined and motivated soldiers in the British service. Their presence in the EU raiding parties added a layer of visceral fear to the American response as the plantation owners of Virginia and Maryland faced the prospect of armed insurrection supported by the world's most powerful navy. The brutality of the campaign is best exemplified by the events of May 3, 1813, at Havre de Grace, Maryland. This raid serves as a microcosm of the devastation that would later visit Washington and highlights the untold stories of local heroism that often fade into obscurity. Admiral Cockburn, incensed by the defiance of the local militia and the sight of an American flag, ordered a punitive strike. At dawn, the town was awakened not by the sun, but by the terrifying screech of Congreve rockets. These weapons, a recent British innovation, were notoriously inaccurate but psychologically devastating. They made horrible whizzing and popping sounds as they arced over the water, sending women and children fleeing from their homes in a state of undressed panic. The defense of the town collapsed almost instantly under the barrage, with the local militia fleeing into the woods. However, amidst this rout, one man stood firm: John O'Neill. An Irish-born militia lieutenant, O'Neill manned the Potato Battery at Concord Point. As 19 barges carrying 400 British troops approached the shore, O'Neill refused to retreat. He single-handedly loaded and fired a cannon at the approaching flotilla. sustaining a recoil injury to his thigh in the process. When the British landed, O'Neill retreated into the town, arming himself with 2 muskets in a futile attempt to rally resistance. He was eventually captured and taken aboard the frigate HMS Maidstone. Admiral Cockburn, intending to make an example of those who resisted, sentenced O'Neill to be shot. It was here that the ruthless admiral showed a rare flash of complexity. O'Neill's 15-year-old daughter, Matilda, hearing of her father's sentence, displayed a courage that matched his own. She rowed out to the British flagship under a flag of truce, or by some accounts confronted the officers on the landing, and pleaded for her father's life. Cockburn was reportedly moved by the girl's eloquence and bravery. In a gesture that seems almost chivalric amidst the carnage, he not only released John O'Neill but presented Matilda with a gold-lined, tortoise-shell snuff box as a token of his admiration. O'Neill would survive the war to become the keeper of the Concord Point Lighthouse, a post he held until his death. The town of Havre de Grace was not so lucky. The British looted every house, destroying what they could not carry. Of the approximately 60 dwellings in the town, between 20 and 40 were incinerated. A wanton barbarity characterized the raid, with soldiers destroying carriage factories, ferry houses, and even stealing bedclothes from infants' cradles. This event, widely reported in the American press, solidified Cockburn's reputation as a violator of all laws, human and divine, and set the stage for the total war that was to come. By the summer of 1814, the geopolitical landscape had shifted seismically. In April, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the French throne, ending the war in Europe. Suddenly, Great Britain was no longer fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The Peninsula Veterans, battle-hardened regiments who had defeated the French armies in Spain and Portugal, were now available for service in North America. In August 1814, a formidable British armada gathered in the Chesapeake Bay. The force included the 4th, 21st, 44th, and 85th Regiments of Foot, along with the Royal Marines and the Colonial Marines. These were professional soldiers, accustomed to the rigors of campaigning and unimpressed by the ragtag American militia. They were commanded by Major General Robert Ross, a gentlemanly but effective officer, and guided by the relentless Admiral Cockburn. The target was the capital of the United States. The British government had authorized a campaign of retaliation for the American burning of York, modern-day Toronto, in 1813, where U.S. troops had torched the Parliament buildings and governor's residence. The British intended to inflict a similar humiliation on Washington, D.C. On August 19th, the British landed at Benedict, Maryland, a small port on the Patuxent River, roughly 25 miles southeast of Washington. The landing was unopposed. The summer of 1814 was one of the hottest on record, with temperatures consistently exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with humidity and mosquitoes. As the British columns formed up, the heat began to take its toll, with soldiers fainting under the weight of their wool uniforms and heavy packs. Yet they marched with the confidence of men who had vanquished the master of Europe. In Washington, the reaction to the invasion was a mixture of denial and panic. Secretary of War John Armstrong steadfastly refused to believe that the British would attack the capital, insisting that their true target must be the commercially significant city of Baltimore. He dismissed Washington as a sheepwalk of no strategic value. This strategic myopia left the capital woefully undefended. President James Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe were less sanguine. Monroe took it upon himself to scout the British positions, riding into southern Maryland with a small cavalry detachment. On August 22nd, he sent a frantic dispatch to the president. "The enemy are advanced 6 miles on the road to the Woodyard. The enemy are in full march for Washington. Have the materials prepared to destroy the bridges." His postscript was a chilling command. "You had better remove the records." This warning triggered a frantic evacuation of the State Department's archives. Clerks Stephen Pleasanton, John Graham, and Josias King purchased coarse linen to make bags, into which they stuffed the nation's most precious documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the correspondence of George Washington. These bags were carted out of the city to a grist mill in Virginia, barely staying ahead of the British advance. General William Winder, the commander of the American defenses, was a political appointee with little military acumen. He spent the days leading up to the battle riding frantically between various points, issuing contradictory orders, and failing to prepare any fortified positions. The American forces, a motley collection of militia and a handful of regulars, were exhausted by constant marching and counter-marching before they even saw the enemy. The British advanced through Nottingham and Upper Marlborough, finding the towns largely deserted. At Upper Marlborough, they detained Dr. William Beans, a local physician, an event that would eventually lead Francis Scott Key to the British fleet and the writing of the national anthem. But that is a story for Baltimore. For now, the focus was entirely on Washington. As the British column pivoted northwest, the pretense of attacking Baltimore was dropped. The road to Washington lay open, blocked only by the eastern branch of the Potomac at the village of Bladensburg. On the morning of August 24th, the heat was already oppressive. President Madison, accompanied by his cabinet, rode out to the American lines at Bladensburg, the first and only time a sitting U.S. president has appeared on a battlefield under active invasion command. In the city behind them, Dolly Madison waited at the president's house, scanning the horizon with a spyglass. She had packed the silver and the red velvet curtains, but she refused to leave until the last possible moment. The American forces, numbering between 6,000 and 7,000, were arrayed in 3 non-supporting lines on the high ground west of Bladensburg. They watched the dust clouds rising in the east, signaling the approach of Ross and Cockburn's Invincibles. The moment of collision was at hand. The government was on the verge of flight, the army was trembling, and the British were marching with the steady, ominous cadence of a force that believed itself unstoppable. The engagement at Bladensburg on August 24, 1814, would be remembered by history not as a battle, but as a race, a derisive term mocking the speed with which the American militia fled the field. However, this characterization glosses over the intense violence of the initial clash and the singular heroism of a small band of sailors and Marines who stood their ground when all others had fled. The terrain at Bladensburg favored the defenders. The road to Washington crossed the eastern branch of the Potomac, now the Anacostia River, over a narrow bridge. West of the river, the ground rose into low hills where the Americans were deployed. General Winder had established 3 lines of defense, but his deployment was fatally flawed. The lines were spaced nearly a mile apart, preventing them from supporting one another. The first line, composed of Baltimore sharpshooters and artillery, covered the bridge. The second and third lines were positioned too far back to engage the enemy as they crossed. Around noon, the British vanguard appeared. General Ross, observing the American disposition, decided not to wait for his entire force to deploy. Despite the blistering heat and the exhaustion of his men, he ordered an immediate assault. The British Light Brigade rushed the bridge. The American artillery in the first line opened fire with deadly effect, initially forcing the British to take cover. However, the British response was technological as much as it was tactical. They unleashed a barrage of Congreve rockets. These missiles, screeching overhead and exploding with erratic fury, terrified the inexperienced American militia. The psychological impact of the whizzing and popping weapons broke the nerve of the first line. Under the cover of the rockets, the British stormed the bridge. The American first line dissolved. The flank protection for the second line evaporated, and as the British regulars pressed forward with fixed bayonets, panic spread like a contagion. General Winder, caught in the confusion, issued orders for a retreat that quickly degenerated into a rout. President Madison and his cabinet, witnessing the collapse, were hurried off the field to avoid capture. Amidst the general disintegration, the Third American Line stood firm. This force was commanded by Commodore Joshua Barney, a Revolutionary War veteran and privateer. Barney commanded a unit of approximately 360 sailors, flotillamen, and 120 U.S. Marines, along with 5 heavy naval guns that they had dragged overland after scuttling their ships in the Patuxent. Unlike the militia, these men were veterans. As the British 85th Regiment advanced up the hill, expecting the third line to crumble like the first two, they were met with a devastating discharge of grape and canister shot. The British advance was checked and they suffered significant casualties. Barney's men did not just hold, they counterattacked. Crying, "Boredom! Boredom!" the sailors and Marines charged, the British infantry with cutlasses and muskets driving them back. For nearly an hour, this small force held the entire British Army at bay. They were the only effective resistance offered that day. However, the collapse of the militia on their flanks eventually doomed them. The British maneuvered to surround Barney's position. Barney himself was severely wounded, a musket ball lodging deep in his thigh. Realizing that his position was untenable and that he was about to be encircled, he ordered his men to retreat to save themselves. Barney, unable to walk, was captured on the field. The aftermath of the battle provided a stark contrast to the brutality of the raids. General Ross and Admiral Cockburn, upon finding the wounded Commodore Barney, treated him with immense respect. They paroled him on the spot and ordered their own surgeons to tend to his wounds. Cockburn, the villain of the Chesapeake, remarked that Barney's men were the only ones who had given them a real fight. This moment of mutual respect between professionals underscored the amateurism of the American leadership. The Bladensburg Races were over. The American Army had ceased to exist as a cohesive force. The road to Washington was wide open, and the British Army, though exhausted and bloodied, prepared to march into history. The sun set on August 24, 1814, over a city gripped by terror. The dust from the fleeing militia had settled, replaced by the ominous tramp of British boots on Maryland Avenue. For the first and only time in its history, the capital of the United States was occupied by a foreign power. What followed was a night of surreal juxtaposition, gentlemen's dinners amidst arson, disciplined destruction alongside petty vandalism. The British column reached the Capitol building around 8 p.m. The structure was an unfinished masterpiece, consisting of 2 wings connected by a wooden walkway, housing the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the Library of Congress. Admiral Cockburn, relishing his triumph, led his men into the House of Representatives. According to contemporary accounts and enduring legend, he climbed into the Speaker's chair, mocking the Democratic Assembly he had displaced. He posed a rhetorical question to his troops. Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned? All for it say, aye. The soldiers roared their approval. The troops piled furniture, books, and documents in the center of the chambers. They used gunpowder paste and rockets to ignite the pyres. The heat was so intense that the glass skylights melted and the stone walls were scorched. The Library of Congress, located in the North Wing, was consumed. Its collection of 3,000 volumes, the intellectual core of the legislature, was reduced to ash. However, not everything was lost. A single ledger, titled An Account of the Receipts and Expenditures of the U.S. for the year 1810, was taken by Admiral Cockburn as a souvenir. He inscribed it to his brother and kept it. It was eventually returned to the Library of Congress in 1940, the sole survivor of the 1814 library fire. While the Capitol burned, illuminating the night sky for miles, a detachment moved down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the President's house, not yet officially called the White House. Earlier that day, the mansion had been prepared for a victory celebration. President Madison and his cabinet were expected to return triumphant. When the British officers, including Ross and Cockburn, entered the abandoned mansion, they found the dinner ready. In a scene of surreal calm, they sat down and ate the president's meal, while the fires of the Capitol raged outside. British soldier George Gleig recounted finding the fine repast, and noted that the officers enjoyed the food before turning to the business of destruction. Once the meal was finished, the destruction began. The furniture was piled up, the red velvet curtains were torn down, and rags soaked in oil were lit. The mansion, with its wooden interior, burned fiercely. By the next morning, only the blackened sandstone shell remained. Admiral Cockburn had a personal score to settle with the National Intelligencer, a Washington newspaper that had frequently attacked his character. He led his troops to the newspaper's offices, intending to burn the building. However, several local women pleaded with him, arguing that the fire would spread to their adjacent homes. Cockburn, displaying the same unpredictable mercy he had shown at Havre de Grace, agreed to spare the building. Instead, he ordered the printing presses destroyed. In a specific act of petty tyranny, he commanded his soldiers to destroy all the C types in the press so that the rascals can have no further means of abusing my name. General Ross had issued strict orders to spare private property, a directive that was largely followed by the British regulars, though less so by the stragglers and local looters. The Patent Office was a notable exception to the government burnings. Its superintendent, Dr. William Thornton, confronted the British and argued that the building contained private inventions that were of benefit to all mankind. He successfully convinced the British to spare the building, saving it from the torch. The Navy Yard, however, was destroyed by the Americans themselves. Commandant Thomas Tingey, following standing orders to prevent the capture of naval assets, ordered the torching of the yard, destroying the new frigate USS Columbia and vast stores of ammunition. August 25, 1814, dawned on a city of smoking ruins. The British were in complete control, but the atmosphere was tense. The Americans were gone, but the environment itself seemed to be turning against the invaders. The day would bring two events that would hasten the British departure: a deadly accident and a meteorological intervention of biblical proportions. In the afternoon, a detachment of British soldiers was sent to destroy the arsenal at Greenleaf Point, now Fort McNair. The Americans had evacuated but left behind a large quantity of gunpowder, some accounts suggest 150 barrels, hidden in a dry well. While the British were disposing of other munitions, an accident occurred. Some accounts say a lit cigar was thrown into the well. Others suggest the firing of a musket ignited the powder. The result was a catastrophic explosion. A 40-foot crater was blown into the earth. Approximately 30 British soldiers were killed instantly, and another 40 to 50 were severely wounded. To put this in perspective, the explosion at the well killed nearly half as many British soldiers as had died in the actual Battle of Bladensburg. The morale of the occupying force, already frayed by the heat and the strange environment, began to crack. As the British were reeling from the explosion, the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple. The oppressive heat of the previous week broke violently. What followed is often described in history books as the tornado that saved Washington. Meteorological analysis and eyewitness accounts confirm that a severe thunderstorm, likely spawning one or more tornadoes, struck the city directly. British soldier George Gleig wrote of the prodigious force of the wind, describing roofs being whisked into the air like sheets of paper. The violence of the storm was unprecedented for the British troops. The lifting of cannons. Eyewitnesses reported that British cannons were physically lifted off the ground and thrown several yards by the wind. Casualties. It is recorded that more British soldiers were killed by the flying debris and collapsing buildings during the storm than by the guns of the American resistance during the occupation. The extinguishing of the fires. The torrential rain, described as resembling a mighty cataract, doused the flames consuming the Capitol's buildings. This intervention likely saved the stone walls of the White House and the Capitol from collapsing entirely, preserving the shells for future reconstruction. A conversation reportedly took place between Admiral Cockburn and a local lady during the height of the storm. The admiral, awed by the violence of the weather, asked, "Great God, madam, is this the kind of storm to which you are accustomed in this infernal country?" The lady replied with stinging wit, "No, sir. This is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city." Whether Providence or meteorology, the storm was the turning point. The British Army, wet, battered, and spooked, decided that their mission was accomplished. The capital was ruined, the government was scattered, and the elements were hostile. It was time to leave. The British invasion force, which had marched so confidently toward Bladensburg, now began its withdrawal. The Invincibles were no longer the pristine force that had landed at Benedict. They were muddy, exhausted, and carrying their wounded. They slipped away from Washington under the cover of darkness on the night of August 25th, leaving their campfires burning to deceive any American observers. While the British retreated, the American government was still in disarray. The narrative of their flight had turned into a chaotic odyssey. Dolly Madison, having saved the portrait of Washington and the red velvet curtains, fled to Georgetown and then into the Virginia countryside. She eventually reunited with the president, but for days, the most powerful men in America were refugees in their own land, sleeping in barns and relying on the charity of strangers. The psychological blow was immense. The president had been forced to flee his own capital. The army had run away. The public buildings were smoking ruins. The sheep walk had been burned, and with it the illusions of American safety. The British Army retraced its steps to Benedict, a grueling march through mud churned up by the storm. They were harassed not by the American army but by fatigue and the elements. They re-embarked on their ships on August 30th, ending the Washington campaign. However, the rule of retaliation had a price. Flushed with success, the British moved on to attack Baltimore, a nest of pirates they deemed a far more valuable prize. But Baltimore was not Washington. The defenses were prepared, the militia was steady, and the harbor was blocked. In the ensuing Battle of North Point on September 12th, General Robert Ross, the conqueror of Washington, was shot and killed by an American sniper, credited to sharpshooters Daniel Wells and Henry McComas. His body was preserved in a barrel of rum and shipped to Halifax for burial. The British fleet failed to reduce Fort McHenry, leading to their withdrawal and the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key, who had been detained by the British fleet during the Washington campaign to negotiate the release of Dr. Beans. The burning of Washington, intended to dishearten the Americans, had the opposite effect. It galvanized the nation. The sight of the ruined capital unified the fractured political parties. Congress, meeting in the spared Patent Office, voted to remain in Washington rather than move the capital to Philadelphia or Lancaster. Reconstruction began immediately. The blackened sandstone walls of the president's house were painted white to hide the scorch marks, cementing the nickname, the White House, into official parlance. Thomas Jefferson, living in debt at Monticello, sold his personal library of 6,487 volumes to Congress to replace the collection burned by Cockburn. This purchase, finalized in 1815 for $23,950, became the foundation of the modern Library of Congress. The War of 1812 ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent, but the burning of Washington remains a defining moment in American history. It destroyed the naive belief that the Atlantic Ocean provided immunity from foreign aggression. It forced the United States to professionalize its military and invest in coastal defenses. Today, the scorch marks are still visible on some of the stones of the White House, preserved during the Truman renovation as a reminder. They stand as silent witnesses to the days when the sky turned black with smoke, the Invincibles marched on the avenue, and a storm from heaven saved the soul of a city.